So to give just a little bit of background about structure and agency, structure is the way that our lives are dictated by the social and cultural institutions, whether it be churches, place of employment, the government, our friends, family, so be it. And agency is what gives each person a degree of control over the course of their lives based on the constraints that they have been given, and how they can put their lives on a path that is beneficial for their survival. So, when talking about structure and agency, a topic that is pretty commonly brought up is gangs and the violence that is coupled with them. So gangs are inherently viewed as violent, and they are organized around this violence so that they can sustain themselves. And the violence is a way that they hold their organization together hierarchically. Historically, gangs were formed as protective agencies for populations that have been victimized by things such as structural violence.
To start off, we'll be looking at a pair of renowned gangs in American society, the Bloods and the Crips. The reach of these gangs has expanded to all across the country with multiple factions of each gang. The Bloods membership is reaching upwards of 20,000, as the Crips membership is over 35,000, with 13,000 alone residing in Los Angeles. So, a brief history of the Bloods and the Crips. The Crips were established in the late 1960s by Raymond Washington and Toki, two South Central Los Angeles high school students. They were established as means of protection against other gangs in the area who were committing various crimes. The Crips quickly grew, and in less than a decade, the small gang spread from Los Angeles to the entire state of California. The Crips have over 800 sets across the country, and with more forming as time moves on. Some famous Crips include Snoop Dogg, Nate Dogg, Schoolboy Q, and Eazy-E. The Bloods were established in the late 1970s by Sylvester Scott and Vincent Owens. They were established in an effort to protect themselves from the many Crip gangs forming in the area. Some famous Bloods include Cardi B, Lil Wayne, and Chris Brown. As for initiation, both the Crips and the Bloods' future members are expected to jump in and invite established members of the gang which they want to join. They are also asked to commit a crime in a particular neighborhood or attack a member of a rival gang. The Crips identify themselves by wearing the color blue, and the Bloods identify themselves by wearing the color red. Members are expected to know the appropriate gang signs so they can quote-unquote rep their set. Okay, so now we're going to dive into the hierarchy seen in American gangs. The violence that is ever present in gangs helps keep the hierarchy organized. They're built on the premise that if you want to stay alive or uninjured, you need to follow the rules of your superior. Okay, so now getting into the gang hierarchy for the Crips and the Bloods. So it consists of a ton of people kind of falling in a order that makes lots of sense. So the first person is the leader. So he's basically the president. He's most of the time in prison, so he just controls it over the phone. Next, we got the advisors, which are all of our financial, legal, and political fronts. Then we got the suppliers. They supply us with the guns and the drugs and, all this other cool stuff. And then the political organizations consist of people who have been in the big groups in the past or the present, and they have an impact on the elections and legislation. We then have the communications. These are the informants who provide information about rival gangs and law enforcement. They're also called messengers sometimes. Then we have the ranking council and the board members. So this is kind of like an advisory committee discussing the gang activities. But they're not faction leaders, but they have a ranking status due to loyalty and performance. We have the chief enforcer, and he coordinates the control of the gang wars and protects the existing territories. The secretary chief disciplines the gang members who violate the rules and regulations. We got the treasurer, who does all the income and the expenses. The bookkeeper is responsible for maintaining records. Area leaders are in charge of specific areas which they are assigned. and they control all the activities within them. The gun supplier has access to all the weapons, and he's usually an area leader. And then we have the trustees and representatives. So this can be thousands of members in the gang. They can be recruiters or street soldiers or runners. Doesn't really matter. So it's basically all of the levels that are seen in the Crips and Blood gang hierarchy.
This same level of hierarchy was present in Renegade Dreams by Lawrence Ralph. To give a little background, Ralph went to live in Eastwood, a neighborhood in Chicago, for 3 years. Throughout his time there, Ralph became acquainted with various members of the community to learn more about how the community operates and the struggles that they are facing. Some of these people were gang members. Hanging around the gang members allowed Ralph to become familiar with some of the hierarchy that was present within the Eastwoodian gangs. Specifically, there were gang leaders/chiefs that ran the operations. There were soldiers that did all the footwork and were ready to, quote-unquote, go to war on command. Underneath of the soldiers were the younger kids that worked the street corners to sell drugs. Furthermore, there was a group that were the black sheep of the gang known as renegades. These members weren't the ideal gang members, as ironic as that might sound. They were still associated with their set, but they had their own way of functioning which didn't mesh well with the overarching set.
Now, transitioning to the other side of the world with an organization similar to the Bloods and the Crips, the Chinese Triad societies, who have their origins in the 17th century and were founded to overthrow the Qing dynasty and restore the Ming dynasty. During this time, they had a strong patriotic doctrine and maintained rigid control over the behavior and activities of their members, limiting their agency but maximizing structure in order to ensure success in their operations and maintaining a more militarized approach. They maintained their secrecy and cultural features from their organization, recruitment, initiation, oaths, and rituals, and had clear rules, conducts, and chains of command. Early in the 1900s, the original Triad Society split into many Triad societies that operated autonomously in different parts of China. Each society has the agency to govern and run themselves and change the cultural practices as they see fit. Each society is independent, but they each retain rigid structures and rules regarding their individual members. The three main Triad societies today are the Xingwo 14K and the Sungyi 1. In 1949, the Chinese Communist Party rose to powers. With this, many Triads escaped to Hong Kong, Taiwan, and other nearby areas. Other refugees began uniting in ethnic groups in order to protect their interests against other ethnic groups. Triad refugees gradually transformed these into Triad societies that use violence to protect themselves, similar to the origins of the Bloods and the Crips. The open door policy of the 1980s encouraged the return of the Triads to mainland China in large numbers. Hong Kong remained the Triad capital. However, this is when we see the increase in modern illegal activities such as drug trade, extortion, gambling, fraud, and money laundering that modern Triads are known for.
Now we are going to talk about a specific faction of the Chinese Triad. The Wo-Shing-Wo was established in the 1930s. Their goal was to overthrow the acting dynasty in order to establish anti-British colonial governance. Since the 1950s, Wo-Shing-Wo membership expanded from 15,000 to 70,000. In the grand scheme, the Wo-Shing-Wo abide by the 36 oaths. These are very strict and have dire consequences. This greatly restricts the autonomy of lower-ranked members. At the faction level, the Wo-Shing-Wo have a centralized operational structure. This structure allows area bosses to have a high degree of autonomy in controlling organized crime. The leaders of each faction are called the Cho-kun, or the chairman, and the Chasso, otherwise known as the treasurer. These roles are elected annually. The Wo-Shing-Wo also have an incense master who is responsible for Triad ceremonial events. The Cho-kun is technically the highest position in the Triad society. However, the reality is that this does not guarantee their power. The Lo Shuk-fu are senior Triads who have stepped down from the Cho-kun position. It is only with their approval that a Cho-kun can be nominated for elections. Because of this, leadership is actually dominated by them. Internal conflict and power struggles between Cho-kun, Chasso, and Lo Shuk-fu have led to gradual decentralization of Wo-Shing-Wo. The decentralization has led to the abandonment of complex initiation ceremonies. This has made it much easier to join the Wo-Shing-Wo, which has led to an influx of members. Over time, power and money have become more important than kinship and brotherhood within the Wo-Shing-Wo ranks.
And now moving to talk about one of the governing documents of the Triad Society, the 36 Oaths. At initiation ceremonies, initiates are required to recite each of the 36 oaths and are required to adhere to them after their initiation. Triads refer to each other as sworn brothers. Many of these oaths seem to be purposed to preserve the well-being of the members individually and likely have historical roots in the 17th century attempts to overthrow dynasties and the refugee era of post-1949. Oath 2 requires that brothers will assist in bearing the parents/brothers either financially or physically. Oath 3 states that they will provide brothers with board and lodging if brothers come to visit them. 7 states that they will offer financial assistance to other brothers. 9 outlaws the assault of female members of brothers' families. 10 outlaws embezzlement and stealing from other brothers. Oath 11 states that they must care for the family of brothers entrusted to their keeping, which is furthered in Oath 19, which says that they must care for the families of brothers who have been arrested and or killed. However, some of the oaths seem to be aimed at protecting the gang from law enforcement or governments themselves. Oath 5 states that they must never disclose the secrets of the family. Oath 18 says they must accept prison sentences if arrested and not place blame on any of their other brothers. Oath 21 says that brothers should be aware of, should make other brothers aware of the government searching for their other brothers. Oath 33 says that they must never give information about brothers' crimes to the government. It maintains a code of secrecy. The Triads take these oaths very seriously, as each oath specifies that failure to comply with the oath is punishable by death, either by a myriad of swords or by 5 thunderbolts.
So we've discussed two differing gangs and their structures, along with how they are put together. But at the same time, at the core of everything, I feel like they both have their similarities and differences, regardless of what they actually value and where the gangs are coming from. So now we're going to discuss on those lines of structure and agency between the Woshingwo and Bloods and Crips. So to start off, both emerge from the lack of care and attention that are put in their respective communities. Do we all agree on that?
Yeah, definitely.
Both were in response to seemingly like oppressive structure coming from outside of their control. So they were a way to organize people together and give those people a sense of agency in their own lives.
Yeah, with the Bloods and Crips, like, they were excluded from society, and like they came to a peak around the time of segregation, even though California necessarily wasn't feeling the Jim Crow laws. Blacks who lived out there were still excluded from society, that everyone else found a place of belonging and, you know, feeling like they were one with a community. And there was just also a lot of lack of care by the government that I feel, allowed both of them to come to rise, which is now seen as a problem. But
yeah, with the triad, it's interesting because a lot of it came around because they were trying to gain freedom from their dictating governments. And even when you look at some of the specific oaths, just about how they want to offer financial assistance to their brothers, and they protect each other's families and take care of each other, you can see that there's kind of a similar thing where they wanted to develop something, some sort of team, I guess, or family that could help them fight back over the oppressive governments.
It seemingly became like survival during the refugee era, escaping the Chinese Communist Party, where they kind of adopted the ethnic groups that were already kind of assembling as refugees, who were already looking out for each other, and from that similar structure kind of just adopted them into triad societies themselves.
yeah, I think it's pretty interesting how both of them kind of have set up their own rules and regulations about how they run and how you're supposed to live by. Like, the triad had like the 36 oaths, and like it's pretty like clear and laid out, but I feel like gangs in America don't necessarily have this long list of rules, and it's kind of just unspoken, I guess, practice or tradition to not snitch on fellow gang members, and you're just supposed to take whatever sentence they give you and not contest it because it can bring down the gang and everyone else in it. But also, like when people's family members go to prison, it's practice to say, oh, we're going to take care of them. But at the same time, it depends on who you are, which I feel is kind of biased in a sense, just because, like in the book, they talked about how Sean was a leading member in the bandits, and both of her parents had kind of like passed it down, and no one really respected her. And if something were to happen to her, no one would really care. They'd just be like, oh, well, I guess families, out on the street, we're not going to really give them anything else to better themselves, which is kind of problematic, but
Seem to be the same way in the triads because they're very like structural, and as you rise up those ranks, obviously you get more benefits from them, even if the oath doesn't like specify like that it's different. It's pretty inferable that different ranks will also receive different levels of assistance from their gang members, and based on that member's loyalty anyways to the gang.
I also think that it's interesting that whether it's unspoken rules or just a list of 36 oaths to follow, that like there's this misconception that people in gangs have more agency, that like because they're in this and they're breaking the law all the time that they have agency, but in reality they're having to follow a really strict set of rules that have pretty dire consequences. Like, I mean, especially for the triad, a lot of times it's death if you don't do what you're supposed to. So I think it's definitely a huge misconception whether you're looking at gangs in the U.S. or in China.
It almost brings up like they have this higher like enrolling structure now, but they got to use their agency to pick that structure, like 'cause they were essentially rebelling and trying to get away from a structure that was being forced on them. So it's their own agency kind of scribing and forming their own structure that benefits themselves. So it's kind of ironic that you got to use one to obtain the other, but you still went back to being under structure despite using your own agency.
yeah, they'd like rather have their own set of, rules and regulations aside from the ones that the government and society are like putting on them, which restricts them. But then I guess they gain some agency by breaking free of that and deciding their own fate, but at the same time they put themselves down. So it's
Yeah, it's almost interesting, like no matter how much you try to escape the current structure, you just end up establishing a new structure in its place. Like you need to have some sort of structure in order to have a functioning society there. So no matter who's putting it together, like you're still going to end up with something. Maybe you're a little bit happier with it, but you kind of need it. Like you're never going to have that complete agency that you want when you try to rebel in the first place.
Doesn't mean that structure is necessarily bad
Yeah.
either. It's just more you have to pick. Hopefully, you get to pick the one that's beneficial to you, and obviously move yourself away from ones that are not, which is what we saw in both contexts of these groups.
so we've seen that both gangs kind of started off like very small in nature, like a lot of gangs that have arisen regardless of what country they're sitting in, whether it be the US or over in China. But as ideas spread, the influence of the gang can become larger than like they initially intended to. Like with the Bloods and Crips, they have like all these smaller factions. Like said before, the Crips have 800 different sets across the country. So that's 800 different tiny little groups that fall under one larger one with like a larger ideal, but then each set has their own, I guess, structure within them that brings on different cultural identities that are present that might not be uniform across the Crip gang as a whole.
That's definitely reflected in the triads too, as it grew to more like of a national slice. It's split into obviously the three main branches we discussed, but even then, each of those branches has branches and families like within it, like for regions and very specific areas, and they're all allowed to operate autonomously and independently, and they still have the same core principles that they were founded on, but they get to adjust their practices and ideology for where they are and what suits them best too. So it's kind of funny that some groups still have like a little bit of agency inside of these larger groups from which they originated.
So, to wrap things up, ultimately we've seen that there is this common misconception that gang members have a lot more agency than someone living outside the gang. While gang members often perform illegal activities, making it seem like they are rejecting the structures of the law, they have actually subscribed to stricter structures and practices that rules from their respective gangs. These are often more restrictive and limit the thoughts and behaviors of the gang members and highly influence the way in which they live. Both the American gangs and the Chinese Triad seemingly are highly beneficial to those within them as well.
They provide protection both from outside oppression and other hardships that the respective members were experiencing at the times of their founding. However, to those outside the gang, because of how protective and powerful the gangs have become in their territories, it is often difficult to live as a neutral or non-member. The gang's fierce loyalty to itself means that members protect and watch out for their own, often at the cost of people not affiliated with the gang.
Yes, they have found the ability to live freely, but under constraints that have given them what benefit? At what cost is it more important to risk some of the core values you've been raised with to associate with the gang, which can lead you to prison if you're lucky, or on the worst side of things, death? Overall, the discussion is a rocky one, but one that needs to occur. But maybe looking deeper into the systematic practices keeping it alive.
This podcast is brought to you by Paul Christensen.